We're not serving the media bias, I guess, just the fact that this channel. Mainstream media has gone over the top. Stay in the truth. I can't believe anything that they say. I just really can't. I think that we need a different point of view on the Republican and Democratic Party.
Libyan rebels load their weapons as they continue searching for Muammar Gaddafi.
I don't want to paint an overly rosy picture because there are also challenges inside of the TNC-controlled area. And one of them is security. We've got a lot of militias and a few police.
How confident are we that these folks, that A, we know who they are, and B, they're not connected to some terrorist organization like Al-Qaeda and will not ultimately turn on the United States? Any worries about them?
Fighting for the opposition. They're not heroes.
The United States condemns in the strongest terms this outrageous and shocking attack. And make no mistake, we will bring to justice the killers who attacked our people.
This is a response sparked by this heinous, hateful, and offensive video.
First time that a diplomat has more balls than somebody in the military.
We had 4 dead Americans. Was it because of a protest, or was it because of guys out for a walk one night and decided they'd go kill some Americans? What difference at this point does it make?
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Lori Dew. When For the Record began investigating the attack on the U.S. consulate in Benghazi, like other news organizations, we hit a lot of roadblocks. From talking points to timelines, bureaucratic and political barriers have concealed many of the facts in this story. Before we deliver our findings to you, we want to explain how we conducted our investigation. Our report comes from individuals who worked both in and outside of Libya. One is a former Navy Rear Admiral, and the other was a paid informant for both the FBI and the CIA. For the Record vetted and researched the materials they presented to us in conjunction with individuals and other U.S. intelligence agencies. Our findings also reflect open source documents combined with interviews we conducted with individuals who had direct knowledge of the diplomatic and military operations in the region. What happened on September 11, 2012 in Benghazi is one of the biggest news stories in recent memory. 4 Americans, including U.S. Ambassador Chris Stevens, were murdered that night. Media outlets that have covered this story tend to focus on the specific events of that night and the post-attack attempts to limit the political fallout. What is mostly ignored are the 18 months leading up to the attack on the consulate. As you're about to see, this was a period in which the United States ignored a negotiated peace accord and assisted in attacking a sovereign nation, and that aligned with forces supporting global jihad. Tonight we're going to show you how the attack on Benghazi is really about a failed foreign policy and a covert operation that saw the United States enable, support, and even arm Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood.
Not too far after 9/11, I was recruited by U.S. intelligence, 3 other agencies, to support the efforts for the war on terror. I travel extensively overseas, primarily Africa, Middle East, Southwest Asia, and have extensive knowledge and capability in these sectors. I am a private citizen working in this world.
I served in the Navy for 32 years. I was a Navy SEAL. You know, I was a combat engineer. I joined an international construction company on their board of directors and as president of their international subsidiary. And I worked with them for 7 years, again, building things around the world, overseas, in Iraq and in Afghanistan.
After he retired in 2005, Rear Admiral Charles Kulik also oversaw projects in Libya, a nation working to develop closer ties to the West. A November 2008 State Department report from then U.S. Ambassador to Libya, Gene Kretz, notes, the U.S. shares key strategic goals with the government of Libya, particularly with respect to combating al-Qaeda and the Libyan Islamic fighting group.
After 9/11 happened, one of the first stops that the CIA made en route to Afghanistan was to Libya. And they met with different officials there in Libya, and Libya at that point was very receptive to cooperating, and that began the engagement with our intelligence.
Muammar Gaddafi made the transformation from sworn enemy to an arm's-length U.S. ally. He agreed to destroy his nuclear weapons program in 2003. He also provided the U.S. with intelligence against al-Qaeda and worked with the U.S. to resolve the Darfur conflict. Despite his support for the war on terror, Gaddafi was potentially becoming a major economic threat to the European Union and the U.S. In a February 2009 cable made public by WikiLeaks, Ambassador Kretz writes about Gaddafi's economic goals: to create a unified Africa which would share a common army, currency, and passport. Kretz was specifically concerned about the stability of the unified currency, since the entire continent would be dependent upon a currency backed by Libya's oil exports. This idea could also jeopardize relations between Libya and EU member states that imported significant amounts of Libya's oil.
But some are convinced intervention in Libya is all about currency, specifically Gaddafi's plan to introduce the gold dinar, a single African currency made from gold, a true sharing of the wealth.
Gaddafi was starting to demand gold for oil. And in demanding gold for oil, he was threatening the fiat currencies of both Europe and the United States. There was fear that if this started to take hold, that there would be some very powerful interests that would start to lose a lot of money.
Weeks and weeks of protests by young, frustrated Tunisian citizens demanding that their leaders step down.
Of course, I was concerned for what was going on in Tunisia, but there wasn't any real impact or notice, in Libya. But the same with Egypt. Having left Libya on the 10th of February 2011, everything was stable.
Anti-Gaddafi activists called for a Libyan Day of Rage on February 17, 2011, to mark the 5th anniversary of the 2006 Benghazi demonstration that turned deadly.
There had been protests in Benghazi before. It wasn't an uncommon occurrence, so I didn't really pay too much attention to it until maybe 2 weeks into it. And it became very apparent that something far greater was going on. The U.S. intelligence community was completely unprepared and caught off guard.
With rebel forces gaining strength, the State Department started to look for a country that would take Gaddafi in to avoid more violence.
In a couple separate instances, in the end of February, I received a request from a senior State Department person who I had worked with in Libya, asking for assistance in identifying some countries in Africa that may take Gaddafi in exile. So I started to make calls to people I know in Africa who could make that decision. Separately, in an official capacity, the intelligence organizations that I work with asked me to identify who the rebels are. As an example, a question that came to me suggested identify terrorist-specific actionable intelligence that relates the terrorists within the rebel ranks to the Muslim Brotherhood, the Hamas, the Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, Al-Qaeda Corps.
On March 10, 2011, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton testified before the House Appropriations Committee, endorsing U.S. support for the Libyan opposition.
Our diplomats are hard at work with our allies and partners to isolate, sanction, and pressure Gaddafi to stop the violence against his own people. We are reaching out to the opposition inside and outside of Libya.
Was there a humanitarian crisis?
No. we actually saw reports of just media misleading. Al Jazeera was interviewing people who were supposed to be eyewitnesses. They weren't even there. They were making up stories, and then other news medias were taking the feed, and this whole illusion of a humanitarian disaster was being created.
Over the next week, Secretary Clinton met with key anti-Gaddafi leaders and named State Department diplomat Chris Stevens liaison to the Libyan opposition.
I saw a disconnect between senior elected officials, Obama, others in Congress who are actively jumping the gun, calling for supporting the rebels and arming them, while I knew that this information was coming forward that illustrated terrorists who would be the recipients of any support that they were given, and Hillary Clinton also being one of them, who was very aggressive in promoting support for the rebels.
On March 17, 2011, the United Nations passed a security resolution ordering Gaddafi to immediately cease fire, while at the same time authorizing NATO forces to take all necessary military action against the Libyan government.
Good afternoon, everybody. Today, I authorize the Armed Forces of the United States to begin a limited military action in Libya.
We have every reason to fear that left unchecked, Gaddafi will commit unspeakable atrocities.
I saw what was going on, I couldn't believe it, and I had people that I knew at African Command. And so rather than calling Washington, I called them and said, what's going on? And I said, I was just there in Libya, I've been all over the country. Is there something I can do to, to help and to maybe see what we can do to resolve this?
Africa Command, known as AFRICOM, connected Kubik with Lieutenant Colonel Brian Linville. He was the military attaché to the U.S. Embassy in Tripoli. He represented DoD's and AFRICOM's interests.
I said to him, what we really need to do is, under the laws of war, have a 72-hour truce to have discussions between battlefield commanders. He thought that was a pretty good idea. And so we drafted kind of a 4-point agreement.
March 19th marked the beginning of 3 days of ceasefire negotiations. The agreement included a 72-hour truce, which would allow Gaddafi to pull back his troops while the ceasefire terms were negotiated. The entire process would be monitored by African Union representatives.
All indications are that a lot of knowledgeable people in the intelligence community that have the duty to protect national security were trying to do their jobs and to stave off a revolution. They were hopeful that this would work, because we all understood that there is enough credible evidence to suggest that Al-Qaeda has now moved into Libya and is actively within the rebel opposition, and it's something that none of us could stop or control.
And so we were moving towards having the ceasefire when word got back to me that higher authorities, Department of Defense, the White House, had basically canceled any discussion of a truce.
It became very apparent that this was never about saving lives, that none of that mattered, because we had given them all the credible information necessary to make a good decision, and there was a ceasefire on the table that was ignored by the White House. And I have to admit, I was shocked coming from a president who had won a Nobel Peace Prize.
On March 23rd, NATO began assuming control of Libyan operations as dictated by the UN security resolution in place. By March 27th, AFRICOM Commander General Carter Ham's control was transferred to NATO Commander and Navy Admiral James Stavridis. However, Ham maintained control of AFRICOM. His liaison, Lieutenant Colonel Linville, was surprised by the move.
Linville was visibly troubled, and he gave the impression that it was Ham did not step down, he was basically removed. And I told him that we can't stop here. We got to go talk to Stavridis. We've got to continue on. And he said to me, sir, this is coming from the highest levels. I recommend you just leave it alone.
On March 24th, in an effort to stave off further military action against the regime, Gaddafi ordered the release of a detailed report to U.S. intelligence operatives that identified al-Qaeda and other extremist ties to the rebels.
The document that Gaddafi provided, the actionable intelligence provided on March 24, was quickly translated and in less than 24 hours put raw on the desk of Obama in the Oval Office. It was provided to the White House and relevant intelligence agencies, and we thought, you know what, we've done it. They can't ignore this information, they can't walk away, they're going to have to take a step back, and that's not what happened.
We have seen flickers in the intelligence of potential al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, we've seen different things, but at this point, I don't have detail sufficient to say that there's a significant al-Qaeda presence or any other terrorist presence in and among these folks.
In his testimony, he states, we've seen flickers of intelligence on al-Qaeda and Hezbollah. He specifically quotes some information from that report, which indicated to me that he had read it.
It's fair to say that if we wanted to get weapons into Libya, we probably could. We're looking at all our options at this point.
We have not made any decision about arming the rebels or providing any arms transfers.
While the Obama administration publicly remained non-committal about supplying arms to the Libyan rebels, on March 30, 2011, Reuters reported that President Obama had already signed a secret order authorizing the CIA to provide covert support to the Libyan opposition, an operation that would become known as Zero Footprint.
I'm not exactly sure why it would be called a covert operation, because it was anything but covert. Everybody outside the United States absolutely knew what was going on.
This man is licensed by the State Department to conduct approved international arms transfers. He is not permitted to reveal his identity on camera. For the Record asked him if it was possible to deliver weapons to the rebels without exposing direct U.S. involvement.
Yes, and that's to outsource that to a foreign ally and handle three components: procurement, transportation, and logistics. Even that part is not 100% untraceable, but it's a good step if you want to eliminate all U.S. involvement.
Is that risky?
Extremely risky.
Explain to us a little bit about this document, though, that the President signed authorizing covert operations and support. What exactly could that include?
Well, it makes it illegal for the CIA to open contacts with the rebels, but the President would still have to sign off on any specific operation.
We were all shocked that this was happening and couldn't believe it was happening, and it was after the March 24 intelligence document that was submitted and put forward, and then we watched senior officials playing out their politics agenda on TV, and we were all essentially told to stand down and not do anything further. I was essentially told to drop it, walk away from all the efforts that have been made, all the efforts and information that existed, and why. It was very apparent that there were some very bad things underway.
Are you concerned about the people that are actually fighting for the opposition here? Any worries about them?
Fighting for the opposition? They're my heroes.
In the spring of 2011, Senator John McCain was the most senior U.S. politician to visit Libya. As a ranking member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, McCain had access to privileged intelligence information.
Now, if I knew that these rebels were terrorists and had the links, he certainly had to know that. And in the government, that information was cast aside.
According to federal law, in the event a covert operation is deemed necessary, it is the President's responsibility to alert the leadership in the House and Senate, as well as the chairman and ranking members of the intelligence committees in both chambers. In the intelligence community, this group is referred to as the Gang of Eight. Ultimately, the Gang of Eight, which included leaders from both parties, should have known about Zero Footprint.
Zero Footprint is a scheme that was concocted by the administration to supply weapons into the Libyan rebel opposition faction while appearing to not be involved in that activity. It's my knowledge that the scheme that was concocted, based upon the evidence that I've seen to this regard, is that the UAE financed the weapons and Qatar was used as the front go-between to handle logistics and the shipping of the weapons in and out of the country.
What are the consequences of that? The consequences are that you lose immediate control over the end user, and you allow them to handle the logistics and transportation so that it prevents you from identifying who this equipment is going to fall into. So if you don't put your protocols in place and you don't deliver it to vetted sources, the equipment can end up anywhere, and it's your name that's going to be on the end user recipient if it gets retransferred to the wrong personnel.
Are you familiar that that's what the transactions happen?
I've watched it unfold in Libya.
People might say, well, it wasn't directly the U.S. doing it. Nothing moved in and out of Libya but for the approval of NATO. So Admiral Stavridis, NATO, had to authorize any of the armed shipments that came in there. And of course, Chris Stevens was in Benghazi helping to coordinate, that armed shipments.
During this investigation, multiple sources confirmed to For the Record, Stevens had extensive experience in international arms transfers.
Benghazi that Mr. Stevens is taking, can you just start from zero on that and tell us what that's about and who's going?
You mean the envoy?
Yeah, please.
He's not, there's been no trip yet, but obviously he's an individual who will give us a better assessment once he's able to go into Libya. And again, his safety, frankly, is paramount here.
So you have the direct involvement of the United States government and NATO allowing all of these covert weapons to flow into the country and not giving them proper checks and balances to ensure that they weren't being used by terrorists.
There was a insurgent commander with the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, which I said is part of on the terrorist list and is the Muslim Brotherhood link, in Libya. This guy Katala, he was in the middle of the Libyan revolution. He was the guy who was receiving arms.
On December 31st, 2013, the State Department designated Ahmad Abu Katala as a global terrorist. He is a senior leader of the group Ansar al-Sharia, known for its extreme hostility toward the West. Katala spent most of his adult life imprisoned by the Gaddafi regime for his Islamist views, fueling his hatred for the dictator.
For 42 years, Muammar Gaddafi's word was law in Libya. He was captured last Thursday by rebel fighters in his hometown of Sirte, had appeared in cell phone video at first dazed and bloodied, then dead on public display.
We came, we saw, we died.
I wasn't surprised that he was killed. I think that was the intention all along.
During the next 11 months, the Islamist militias in Libya became increasingly violent, especially in Benghazi. A report issued by the Senate Select Committee for Intelligence identified 20 separate attacks conducted by armed militia members using IEDs, grenades, and bombs.
I was getting requests and taskings to identify specific targets and threats to U.S. persons and facilities in the months leading up to Benghazi. So the intelligence community was clearly receiving a variety of information and chatter that there were credible threats.
Stevens filed a request with the State Department on July 9, 2012, asking for at least 13 additional security agents. His request went unanswered. In an August 16, 2012 cable, Stevens described deteriorating conditions in Benghazi, specifically warning of 10 Islamist militia and al-Qaeda training camps. Then, 1 week before the attack on the U.S. mission in Benghazi. An AFRICOM report described how the militias were taking advantage of the lax security. Yet the State Department again refused to provide additional security for Stevens, and he was to maintain his current security detail, which consisted of the Blue Mountain Group, a private British security firm, and members from the February 17th Martyrs Brigade, a Libyan militia that would later be complicit in the September 11th attack on the consulate.
Why would Steve, in your opinion, disregard what its own ambassador was saying?
Absolutely no idea, and it defies any level of common sense. Is it incompetence? Possibly. Was there another agenda going on? Possibly. There are a lot of people who work under the auspice of the State Department stationed overseas and are cover officers for the CIA. I believe Chris was one of those, and I have lots of reasons as to why I believe that. I believe that post-revolution, post-Gaddafi's death, that the entire operation in Libya became a CIA operation.
For the Record has learned that the Department of Defense and the FBI had virtually no knowledge of Operation Zero Footprint, which is consistent with the Senate Intelligence Committee's finding that AFRICOM Commander Carter Ham was not aware a CIA annex existed in Benghazi at the time of the attacks. As the committee points out, we are puzzled as to how the military leadership expected to effectively respond and rescue Americans in the event of an emergency when it did not even know of the existence of one of the U.S. facilities. Details of the covert weapons operation were tightly guarded among select members of Congress, the CIA, the State Department, and the White House, who were all trying to manage a covert operation that would expose a U.S. policy decision to arm Al-Qaeda, the Muslim Brotherhood, and other Islamist militias. The attack on September 11, 2012 was on the verge of becoming a political and diplomatic disaster 2 months before a U.S. presidential election.
I just think that that's where we are right now, that it needs to be investigated. We need to get the answers to the questions. And when we dig into Benghazi, we're going to find that the Benghazi story goes much deeper, and it gets back into the army of the rebels in violation of U.S. law. It gets back into attacking a sovereign nation without any authority to do so.